There exists within the human psyche a terror so primal, so fundamentally threatening to our sense of safety and survival, that most people will endure incredible suffering in relationships rather than face the prospect of being alone. This is not the natural preference for companionship that characterizes healthy human beings, nor the simple enjoyment of social connection that enriches our lives. This is something far more desperate and destructive. A phobic-level terror of solitude that compels us to cling to harmful relationships, accept unacceptable treatment, and sacrifice our authentic selves on the altar of avoiding abandonment. If you have ever stayed in a relationship that was slowly killing your soul rather than risk being alone, if you have ever felt panic at the thought of spending an evening by yourself, if you have ever made compromises that betrayed your own values to avoid being left, then you have experienced this phantom terror that haunts the unconscious mind. Jung understood what most people refuse to acknowledge, that the fear of being alone is not actually about being alone, but about being left alone with the parts of ourselves we have spent our lives trying to escape. Solitude threatens to remove the external distractions, the relationship dramas, the constant social stimulation that keeps us from encountering the inner emptiness, the unresolved pain, the existential questions that we cannot answer, the shadow aspects of ourselves that we cannot bear to acknowledge. The fear of being alone is ultimately the fear of being with ourselves, of facing the reality of who we are when stripped of our social roles, our relationship functions, our external validations. This terror manifests in what I call relationship desperation, the compulsive need to always be connected to someone, anyone, regardless of the quality of that connection or the cost to our well-being. The person terrified of being alone will maintain toxic friendships rather than face solitude, will stay in abusive partnerships rather than risk abandonment, will create drama and conflict rather than experience the peace of their own company. They become addicted to connection itself, mistaking intensity for intimacy, chaos for passion, dependency for love. The phantom terror operates through what Jung recognized as abandonment programming, deep conditioning, often from childhood, that equates being alone with being unloved, unwanted, or fundamentally defective. This programming creates a survival response to solitude that is completely disproportionate to the actual threat. The nervous system responds to being alone as if it were a life-threatening emergency, activating fight-or-flight responses that make solitude feel literally unbearable. The body cannot distinguish between being alone and being in mortal danger, because the early conditioning has fused these experiences into a single terror. Perhaps most tragically, this fear creates what I call provisional existence, a life lived entirely in relation to others, where the person never develops an authentic sense of self because they are always performing for an audience, always adjusting to others' expectations, always seeking external validation to confirm their worth. They become human chameleons, changing their colors to match whatever environment they find themselves in, never developing the stable sense of identity that can only emerge from spending time alone with oneself. The terror of being alone also manifests through silence phobia, the inability to tolerate quiet moments when the mind is not distracted by external stimulation. These individuals fill every moment with noise, activity, social interaction, or digital distractions, because silence threatens to reveal the inner void, the unprocessed emotions, the authentic self that has been buried beneath layers of social conditioning. They become addicted to busyness, to constant stimulation, to the endless chatter of modern life, because stillness feels like death. This fear operates through what Jung called projection as protection, the unconscious tendency to locate our sense of worth, meaning, and identity in other people rather than developing these qualities within ourselves. We project our own capacity for love onto others and then become dependent on their reflection of it back to us. We project our own wisdom onto others and then feel lost without their guidance. We project our own strength onto others and then feel helpless without their support. This projection creates a psychological dependency that makes being alone feel like losing pieces of ourselves. The phantom terror also creates what I call emergency bonding, the tendency to form intense, immediate connections with others as a way of avoiding the anxiety of solitude. These bonds are not based on genuine compatibility or shared values, but on the mutual need to avoid being alone. The person terrified of solitude will bond with anyone who provides temporary relief from their abandonment anxiety, often creating relationships that are intense, but ultimately hollow because they are based on fear rather than love. Perhaps most insidiously, this terror makes us susceptible to what Jung recognized as psychological predators. Individuals who have learned to exploit others' fear of being alone as a mechanism of control. They use the threat of abandonment as a weapon, create artificial scarcity of their attention and affection, and position themselves as the solution to the loneliness they themselves create. The person terrified of being alone becomes easy prey for those who understand that the fear of solitude can be weaponized into the basis for psychological manipulation and emotional abuse. To understand why the fear of being alone strikes so deeply into the human psyche, we must trace its roots back to the earliest formations of our psychological architecture, where Jung recognized that the seeds of abandonment terror are planted in the tender soil of childhood experience. The adult who cannot tolerate solitude is not displaying weakness or character flaw, but carrying forward survival strategies learned in circumstances where being alone truly was dangerous, where abandonment was not just an emotional threat, but a potential death sentence for a dependent being who could not survive without caretaking. The most obvious origin lies in what I call literal abandonment experiences. Children who were actually left alone before they were developmentally ready, who experience the terror of abandonment as a lived reality rather than a phantom fear. These experiences create what Jung would recognize as complex formation, autonomous psychological structures that continue to operate in adulthood, triggering the same survival responses that were once appropriate but are now destroying their capacity for healthy relationships and peaceful solitude. But the more common and perhaps more damaging origin lies in what I call emotional abandonment while physically present. Children who were left alone emotionally, even when their caretakers were physically available. These children learned that physical presence does not guarantee emotional safety, that they could be surrounded by people yet feel fundamentally alone and unsupported. This early experience creates a deep confusion about connection and solitude, where being alone triggers the terror of emotional abandonment, while being with others provides no real sense of safety or security. Perhaps most tragically, abandonment terror often stems from what Jung called conditional love experiences. Children who learned that affection, attention, and acceptance were contingent on their performance, their compliance, their ability to meet others' needs rather than express their own. These children developed what I call performance-based attachment, where they learned to equate being loved with being useful, being wanted with being needed, being valued with being entertaining or helpful. When these survival strategies are no longer required, when they are alone without anyone to perform for, they experience not peace, but terror, because they have never learned that they are worthy of love simply for existing. The terror also develops through what I call emotional labor conditioning. Children who learned that their primary function was to regulate others' emotions, to manage family dynamics, to sacrifice their own needs for the sake of keeping others happy and stable. These children never developed the capacity to be alone because they were never allowed to focus on their own inner world. Their attention was always directed outward toward the emotional needs of others. Being alone triggers panic because it removes the external source of their sense of purpose and identity. Another common origin lies in enmeshment trauma. Children who grew up in families where individual boundaries were not respected, where the child's identity was merged with the parent's emotional needs, where separation was treated as betrayal or abandonment. These children learned that being separate equals being bad, that individuality threatens connection, that developing an autonomous self would result in the loss of love. For these individuals, being alone triggers not just loneliness, but profound guilt and shame because they were taught that independence is selfish and separation is cruel. The fear of being alone also develops through what Jung would recognize as identity diffusion. Children who never developed a stable sense of self because they were constantly adapting to others' expectations, needs, and emotions. They learned to be different people in different relationships, to shapeshift according to what others needed them to be, never developing the consistent inner core that would allow them to enjoy their own company. Being alone is terrifying because they literally don't know who they are when they're not reflecting someone else's needs or expectations. Perhaps most insidiously, abandonment terror often stems from love as intrusion conditioning. Children who learned that love involves the complete loss of privacy, autonomy, and personal boundaries. They experienced care as control, attention as invasion, and connection as consumption. These individuals develop a complex relationship with both connection and solitude. They crave connection, yet fear engulfment. They seek solitude, yet terror abandonment. They become trapped in a psychological prison where neither being alone nor being with others provides genuine safety or satisfaction. The terror also develops through what I call existential abandonment. Children who were left to face life's most frightening questions and experiences without adequate support or guidance. They learned that being alone means being unprotected from overwhelming feelings, existential terror, or traumatic experiences. Their fear of solitude is not just about missing human connection, but about being defenseless against the full weight of existence, the raw reality of life that they were never taught to bear alone. These childhood origins create what Jung called arrested development, adults who remain psychologically dependent on others for emotional regulation, identity formation, and existential security. They never develop the inner resources necessary for healthy solitude because their developmental process was interrupted by the need to focus on survival rather than growth, on managing others rather than developing themselves. When we examine the fear of being alone through Jung's lens of shadow psychology, we discover that what we most fear about solitude is not the absence of others, but the presence of ourselves. Specifically, the presence of all the aspects of ourselves that we have spent our lives trying to avoid, deny, or project onto others. Solitude threatens to remove the external distractions, the relationship dramas, the constant social stimulation that keeps us from encountering what Jung called the shadow, the repository of everything we have deemed unacceptable about ourselves and banished from conscious awareness. The shadow of solitude first reveals what I call the abandoned child within, the part of ourselves that carries all the unprocessed pain, unmet needs, and unhealed wounds from our earliest experiences. This inner child holds the terror of abandonment, the rage at being left, the grief of unmet needs, the shame of not being enough to keep love from leaving. When we are alone, this wounded child emerges from the depths of the unconscious, demanding attention, comfort, and healing that we do not know how to provide. The fear of being alone is often the fear of meeting this child's pain without the distractions that usually keep it hidden. Solitude also threatens to reveal the empty self, the recognition that beneath all our social roles, relationships, and external achievements lies a void where a genuine sense of self should be. This emptiness is not pathological, but existential, the natural result of living a life oriented entirely toward others' expectations rather than our own authentic nature. The fear of being alone is often the fear of discovering that we don't know who we are when we're not being someone for someone else, that we have no core identity beyond our function in others' lives. Perhaps most terrifyingly, solitude reveals what Jung called the unlived life, the awareness of all the paths we didn't take, the dreams we abandoned, the aspects of ourselves we sacrificed for the sake of maintaining relationships and social acceptance. In solitude, we cannot avoid confronting the gap between who we are and who we might have been, between the life we're living and the life we secretly long to live. This confrontation with our unlived potential can feel more threatening than any external danger because it demands that we take responsibility for our choices and consider the possibility of change. The shadow of solitude also contains what I call the authentic self, the person we truly are beneath all the adaptations, accommodations, and performances we've learned to maintain connections with others. This authentic self holds our real opinions, our genuine desires, our actual values, our true feelings, all the aspects of ourselves that we've learned to hide or modify to avoid rejection or conflict. The fear of being alone is often the fear of meeting this authentic self and discovering that it might demand changes in our life that would threaten our current relationships and social position. Solitude threatens to reveal the existential questions that we use relationships to avoid confronting. What is the meaning of my life? What happens when I die? What is my purpose? Why do I exist? These questions cannot be answered through external validation or social connection. They require the kind of deep contemplation that only emerges in solitude. The fear of being alone is often the fear of facing these ultimate questions without the comfort of others' presence to distract us from their weight. The shadow of solitude also contains what Jung called the God-shaped hole, the spiritual emptiness that exists when we have not developed a relationship with the transcendent, the sacred, the divine within ourselves. This emptiness creates a desperate need for others to fill the void that can only be filled through spiritual connection. The fear of being alone is often the fear of encountering this spiritual emptiness and recognizing that no human relationship can fill the space meant for our connection to the divine. Perhaps most challenging, solitude reveals the responsibility of freedom, the recognition that we have far more choice in our lives than we allow ourselves to acknowledge. In relationships, we can blame others for our limitations, our unhappiness, our inability to pursue our dreams. In solitude, these excuses dissolve, and we are forced to confront the reality that we have been choosing our limitations, that we have been participating in our own imprisonment. The fear of being alone is often the fear of recognizing our own power and the responsibility that comes with it. The shadow of solitude also contains the creative force, the artistic, innovative, generative energy that can only fully emerge when we are not performing for others or adjusting to their expectations. This creative force is wild, unpredictable, and potentially disruptive to the stable relationships and social roles we've constructed. The fear of being alone is often the fear of what we might create, express, or become if we were truly free from others' influence and expectations. Most fundamentally, the shadow of solitude reveals what I call the capacity for self-love, the ability to enjoy our own company, to find satisfaction in our own thoughts and feelings, to provide ourselves with the care and attention we seek from others. This capacity threatens the dependent relationships we've built on neediness rather than choice, on fear rather than love. The fear of being alone is often the fear of discovering that we don't need others as desperately as we thought, that we are capable of providing ourselves with much of what we seek from relationships. At the heart of the fear of being alone lies what Jung would have recognized as one of the most pervasive and destructive addictions of modern life, the addiction to external validation, the compulsive need for others' approval, attention, and acknowledgement to feel real, worthy, and alive. This addiction operates like any other, creating tolerance that requires increasingly larger doses of validation to achieve the same sense of worth, withdrawal symptoms when validation is absent, and a progressive deterioration of the capacity to self-validate, self-soothe, and self-regulate. The fear of being alone is fundamentally the fear of withdrawal from this validation addiction, the terror of being left without the external supply that has become essential to psychological survival. This addiction manifests through what I call approval-seeking as identity, the unconscious organization of the entire personality around gaining others' positive regard, rather than developing authentic self-regard. The person addicted to external validation has learned to monitor others' reactions constantly, to adjust their behavior, opinions, and even their emotional expressions to maintain a steady supply of approval. They become human mood rings, changing their colors to match what they perceive others want to see, never developing the stable sense of self that would allow them to provide their own validation. The validation addiction creates what Jung would recognize as vicarious living, the tendency to experience worth, meaning, and identity through others' perceptions rather than through direct self-experience. The person becomes dependent on others' eyes to see themselves, others' opinions to know their value, others' emotions to feel real. They lose contact with their own inner compass, their own sense of what is right, true, or valuable, becoming psychological satellites orbiting around others' approval rather than developing their own gravitational center. Perhaps most tragically, this addiction creates what I call performance-based existence, a life lived entirely as a show for others, where authenticity becomes impossible because every thought, feeling, and action is filtered through the question, how will this appear to others? The person becomes an actor who has forgotten their real identity, playing roles designed to earn applause while their authentic self atrophies from neglect. Being alone threatens to end the performance, to reveal the actor behind the mask, to force an encounter with the self that has been sacrificed for others' approval. The addiction also manifests through emotional co-regulation dependency, the inability to manage one's own emotional states without others' presence, input, or reassurance. The person has never learned to self-soothe, to find their own emotional center, to provide themselves with the comfort and stability they seek from others. Their emotional thermostat is externally controlled, making them dependent on others' moods, reactions, and availability for their own psychological equilibrium. Solitude threatens to expose this dependency and force them to develop the inner resources they never learned to cultivate. This validation addiction creates what Jung called projection as protection, the unconscious tendency to locate one's sense of worth, wisdom, and power in others, rather than developing these qualities within oneself. The person projects their own capacity for love onto others, and then becomes dependent on others' love to feel lovable. They project their own wisdom onto others, and then feel lost without others' guidance. They project their own strength onto others, and then feel helpless without others' support. This projection creates a psychological dependency that makes being alone feel like losing essential parts of oneself. The addiction also operates through what I call distraction as avoidance, the compulsive need to fill every moment with external stimulation, social interaction, or activity to avoid the inner encounter that solitude would require. The person becomes addicted to busyness, to constant communication, to the endless stream of digital validation that modern technology provides. They use others' presence, real or virtual, as a drug to avoid the discomfort of meeting themselves, of facing their own thoughts and feelings without external mediation. Perhaps most insidiously, the validation addiction creates authentic self-abandonment, the progressive loss of contact with one's own desires, values, opinions, and feelings in favor of whatever will earn others' approval. The person learns to suppress their authentic responses, to override their genuine feelings, to abandon their real dreams in favor of whatever version of themselves others seem to prefer. They become skilled at reading others' needs and expectations while becoming strangers to their own. The fear of being alone intensifies because solitude threatens to reveal the extent of this self-abandonment, to force an encounter with the authentic self that has been sacrificed for others' approval. In solitude, there is no audience to perform for, no validation to seek, no distraction from the reality of who they are when they're not being someone for someone else. This prospect feels like death because they have confused their performance with their identity, their function with their essence, their ability to please others with their right to exist. The validation addiction also creates what Jung would recognize as codependent consciousness, the inability to distinguish between one's own thoughts, feelings, and desires and those of others. The person becomes so attuned to others' emotional states that they lose contact with their own, so focused on others' needs that they forget they have needs, so invested in others' happiness that they don't know what would make them happy. Being alone threatens to collapse this codependent structure and force them to develop the differentiated consciousness that healthy relationships require. We arrive now at the most transformative threshold in the journey away from abandonment terror, the recognition that what we have been fleeing from in solitude is actually what we most need to find. Not the emptiness we feared, but the fullness we never knew existed. Not the abandonment we dreaded, but the self-encounter we've been avoiding. Not the death we imagined, but the rebirth that can only occur when we finally learn to be alone with ourselves, without terror, without distraction, without the desperate need for others to validate our existence. This transformation requires what Jung called the courage to be, the willingness to face ourselves completely, to embrace our solitude as sacred space rather than existential threat. The journey begins with what I call graduated solitude practice, learning to be alone for increasing periods without panic, without the compulsive need to reach out to others, without filling every moment with distractions. This practice starts with small doses of conscious aloneness, perhaps just 5 minutes of sitting quietly without digital stimulation, gradually building the capacity to tolerate longer periods of solitude without anxiety. Like any recovery process, this requires patience, self-compassion, and the understanding that the discomfort is temporary while the benefits are permanent. The transformation requires what Jung called befriending the shadow, learning to welcome rather than fear the aspects of ourselves that emerge in solitude. This means sitting with the abandoned child within and offering it the comfort it never received. It means embracing the emptiness as space for growth rather than evidence of deficiency. It means greeting the authentic self as a long-lost friend rather than a dangerous stranger. It means facing the unlived life not as a source of regret, but as an invitation to begin living more authentically. Perhaps most importantly, the journey requires developing what I call self-companionship, the ability to relate to ourselves with the same kindness, interest, and care that we would offer a beloved friend. This means learning to enjoy our own thoughts, to find our own company interesting, to provide ourselves with the attention and care we have been seeking from others. Self-companionship is not narcissism, but the foundation of all healthy relationships, for we cannot truly love others until we have learned to love ourselves. The transformation also involves what Jung understood as individuation, the process of becoming who we truly are, rather than who we think we should be or who others need us to be. This process can only occur in solitude, where the external pressures and expectations that shape our behavior are absent, allowing our authentic nature to emerge. Individuation requires the courage to disappoint others, to set boundaries, to prioritize our own development over others' comfort, to choose authenticity over approval. The journey to sacred solitude requires developing what I call internal authority, the capacity to trust our own perceptions, to validate our own experiences, to make decisions based on our own values rather than others' expectations. This authority cannot be borrowed from others or granted by external sources. It must be developed through the practice of being alone with ourselves, learning to listen to our own inner wisdom, and trusting our own judgment, even when it conflicts with others' opinions. Perhaps most beautifully, the transformation reveals what Jung called the self, the deeper, more essential aspect of our being that exists beyond our ego, our social roles, our relationship functions. This self is not lonely because it is connected to something larger than individual personality, to what Jung called the collective unconscious, to the archetypal patterns that connect all human beings. When we learn to access this deeper self through solitude, we discover that we are never truly alone because we are connected to the source of all existence. The sacred journey also involves developing what I call creative solitude, the capacity to use alone time, not as punishment to be endured, but as opportunity to be celebrated. This means learning to create, to explore, to dream, to play in solitude. It means discovering that our most profound insights, our most authentic expressions, our most innovative ideas often emerge when we are alone with ourselves, free from the need to explain, justify, or adjust our thoughts for others' consumption. The transformation culminates in what Jung called the marriage of opposites, the integration of our need for connection with our capacity for solitude, our love for others with our love for ourselves, our social nature with our individual essence. The person who has learned to be alone discovers that they can choose relationships from wholeness rather than neediness, from desire rather than desperation, from love rather than fear. They become capable of what I call conscious connection, relationships that enhance rather than diminish their solitude, that celebrate rather than threaten their individuality. The ultimate revelation is that solitude and connection are not opposites, but complementary aspects of a whole life. The person who has learned to be alone can be truly present with others because they are not using others to escape from themselves. They can love without clinging, care without controlling, connect without losing themselves. They have discovered that the capacity for solitude is not the enemy of love, but its prerequisite, not the opposite of connection, but its foundation. Your fear of being alone has been protecting you from the very encounter that would liberate you. Your terror of solitude has been keeping you from the sanctuary that awaits within your own being. The journey to sacred solitude is not a retreat from life, but a preparation for living more fully, more authentically, more lovingly than you ever imagined possible. If you recognize your own terror of solitude in these words, if you see how your fear of being alone has been shaping your relationships and limiting your life, then your transformation begins with the most courageous act you can commit. Spend 1 hour today in complete solitude without any distractions, without reaching out to others, without filling the time with activities designed to avoid meeting yourself. Subscribe to this channel if you're ready to explore the deeper psychological work that transforms the terror of solitude into the sanctuary of self-encounter. Share this video with someone else who needs to understand that their fear of being alone is not weakness, but a call to the most important relationship they'll ever develop, the one with themselves. And most importantly, start today. Turn off your phone, step away from social media, cancel the plans you made to avoid being alone, and sit with yourself for 1 hour. Feel the anxiety rise and breathe through it. Notice the impulse to reach out to others and resist it. Allow yourself to encounter whatever emerges in the silence, your wounded child, your authentic self, your unlived dreams, your creative potential. Your fear of being alone has been keeping you from the very encounter that would liberate you. Your terror of solitude has been protecting you from discovering that you are your own best companion, your own source of wisdom, your own sanctuary from the chaos of the world. The people who truly love you want you to be whole, not dependent. They want you to choose them from fullness, not desperation. They want to be with someone who enjoys their own company, not someone who uses others to escape from themselves. Stop running from solitude and start running toward it. Stop fearing yourself and start befriending yourself. Stop avoiding the encounter that would set you free. Your greatest love story is waiting to begin, the one between you and yourself.